Hey, what's up everybody, this is Muth24, and today I'm taking a look at the third and final novel in the Halo Forerunner saga. This is Halo Silentium, and as the cover art might imply, the Librarian and the Erdidact are pretty important characters in this storyline, as are Bornstellar, who is now the Isodidact, as well as a bunch of other kind of less prominent Forerunner characters. They do have names in the storyline, and they do see, I think, decent rounding out, enough for the sake of their purposes as supporting characters, but are not nearly as well established as the Didacts or the Librarian, and that's for good reason, because those are the main characters of this story. We also see some parts of the story relayed from the perspective of the monitors being offensive bias and Guilty Spark sort of retroactively telling some things about the Forerunner Empire here and there. And the interesting thing about this novel compared to the ones that preceded it is that it's presented in sort of a series of journal entries or data bits on the Forerunner Empire. It jumps around in perspective a lot, and I think that's what makes it one of the more interesting approaches I've done with this series. It is, from the Forerunner perspective, almost entirely throughout the book, which is great because I enjoy reading the novels in Forerunner stories more so when it's the Foreigners talking about their empire and very confident in the way that they describe their technology and their culture and all that. I think the first novel did a good job for its first half, doing that whole sort of stranger in a strange land approach with Chakas and Riser, and even Bornstellar to a lesser extent, going along on the space adventure with the Didact. And then the second half being more about, okay, here's what we're working with, here's our sort of last-ditch effort we're putting in place with the Halo rings, the Floods encroaching on our territory and all that. We've got to deal with Medicant bias, going rogue and all that. And I certainly appreciated that for the first book. I think it works really well. But I think in terms of just overall presentation factor, this one is my favorite of the three. That said, I still think the story of the first one's a little bit stronger, but this one is certainly a step up from the second novel, and I'll get into that as we go along here. Basically, the whole trilogy has been building up to the end of the Forerunner Empire, and the first novel, Cryptum, started off with this whole idea of, like, these are the last days of the Forerunner Empire. I don't know exactly how much time has passed between the first novel and the third here. There's something they say in there about the Didact having been gone for years, but I wasn't sure if that was a reference to something beforehand or something of a reference to the time between the first game, or sorry, the first book and this book. It may have been that he was kind of off on the planet that the Master Builder left him for years before he came back, and that because Forerunners live for so long, their perception of time is that that was, minutes, hours, days, as opposed to actual years. Even though it was, they don't perceive it quite the same way as we do, because it's not as long of a stretch of time to them. It would also make a little bit more sense if it was years, given how far along the Flood are in basically taking over the entire galaxy by the time that this novel takes place. We also get to see some really cool stuff from the Librarian as she's picking her species to, her selections for different species to bring aboard the Ark and eventually repopulate the galaxy once the rings have been fired. Because at the time that this novel starts, it's basically a foregone conclusion that we're going to have to fire the Halo rings. We can try our best to hold back the Flood, but it's, we're losing this war. And so, ultimately, we are going to have to fire the array, cause our own extinction, and leave the future to whatever other species take up the mantle. And the interesting thing about this is we find out kind of later on that there was a bigger, I guess, play going on here than was initially let on. And we find out interesting things about the precursors that help, I think, round out the whole story of the Forerunners and their ascension to become the most advanced and most capable species in the galaxy, and their sort of role as crafters and influencers of every other thing that's happened in the past 10,000 years or what have you. It's really interesting to see that they went to very specific places with these characters and these events. Some darker places than I think I expected out of the novel. And I think that's great. I'm glad that it surprised me that way. I was kind of expecting this novel to be sort of just, all right, you know the story so far, let's get on with it, let's show them firing the array and be done with it. But it definitely threw me a couple curveballs, and I really appreciated that. And I think they work really well for this story. It makes the Foreigners seem a little bit more like humans. Obviously, they're still alien. They're sort of on their own plane of thought and behavior and all that. They've always kind of been something superior to humans, not just in the way that they are technologically advanced and have all these crazy creations and all that across the galaxy, but in the way they carry themselves. They think very highly of themselves, and even especially the Erdidact is sort of thinks humanity and a lot of other species are beneath him. That they are troublesome species. They cause war and all that. But there are some things that we found out about the Foreigners in their past that makes them maybe not so different from the humans. It comes in later in the novel, but it's an interesting little point that they bring up, and I definitely appreciated it. We also see sort of the Didact's final push toward his more warlike nature that he has in the fourth Halo game. And it's, I think, a little quick the way they handle it. It's not necessarily inappropriate given his character development over the course of this novel series, but it's kind of weird because he's absent for basically the entire second novel, and then he comes back for the third one, and I feel like they could have done better at building that up if he had been present in the second novel, if they had sort of flashed back between Chaka's situation and the Didact being abandoned on the world that he was. If they kind of jump back and forth between that, I think it would have built up a little bit better to this sort of end-all decision that he's got to make at the end of this novel. That said, I don't think it's the worst they could have done. I just think it was a little clunky. Not too terribly so, but it could have been a little bit smoother, that particular transition. That said, I love the librarian's perspective on things. It's really interesting to see someone who's a non-combatant, someone who's more about the science and the cultivation of the galaxy. I think it's really cool. And just the writing overall is great with this. I love the voice that Greg Bear has given the Foreigners and the way that they behave and the way that their language comes across in how they distinguish their different elements of their culture, elements of society, their different roles and stuff, and how those are viewed as almost different races to a certain degree. It's kind of weird, but they have their life shapers, they have their warriors, they have their builders, and so on and so forth. And sometimes they're kind of at odds with one another. Not necessarily like full-on military conflict with one another, but there are some political bids here and there. And as the war with the Flood gets more and more dire, those sort of barriers have to fall for the sake of diplomatic convenience, for the sake of everything's going to hell in a handbasket, so we have to work together. And even at the very end, there's still sort of this, yeah, we're working together, but we're not really happy about it, notion from some of the other Foreigners. And so it was kind of interesting to see, this society that holds himself so highly kind of falling into this very flawed and very, I guess, human behavior, if you will. But that said, I think this is a great novel, a great way to wrap up the Forerunner saga. It doesn't do a whole lot in the way of epilogue, and I think that's fine because basically once this ends, it set up everything else for the rest of the Halo universe, and that's just fine. It didn't really have to have a whole lot of epilogue. It does have one little extra chapter at the end that I think is a nice send-off to this novel series, and it does sort of make a concrete impression of where certain characters originate from in the Halo games and where certain events play into the larger Halo universe, and I definitely appreciated that. But yeah, this is, I think, a great read. Like I said with the previous novel, I think that this is a great science fiction series in general. It's simple enough that you can jump into it and not have played any of the games and still appreciate it. But that said, there's something about the Forerunner culture and the way they present them that's so complicated and so just bizarre that it's absolutely, I don't know, really difficult not to get engrossed in and not to just love reading about them. So I definitely appreciated that. I definitely appreciated the fact that, this being the last days of the Forerunner War, they didn't just go the easy route. They throw some curveballs in there, like I mentioned, and that's pretty cool to see something different, something unexpected. But yeah, I highly recommend this. I recommend the whole series as a set as well. I think they're, as 3 novels, the best Halo novels I've read. And with that, I will see you guys next time.